Welcome to From Sludge to Solutions, Reimagining Wastewater Management in Maine. Thank you all of you for joining live, and thank you for those watching the recording. Today, we are going to be turning our attention to one of the most pressing and complex infrastructure challenges facing Maine today: what to do with our sludge. We are so fortunate to be joined by two speakers offering important complementary perspectives on this issue. The first is Dan Marks, the Wastewater Superintendent for the Town of Falmouth. And we're also joined by Adam Nordell, who's the Campaign Manager for Maine Farmland Contamination with Defender Health. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today. And just a little side note, Dan will kick things off with a presentation, and then we'll hear from Adam, who will offer additional context. My name is Maggie Summers. I am the program and I am the outreach director at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. I need to update that. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving environment for all, future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. And since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental, social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. And just a few notes before we dive in. We're going to hear from Dan and Adam first, and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session. Please don't wait, though. You can send your questions to me and Rainey as they occur to you. We ask that you not directly message the speakers because they're going to be focusing on their presentation. And if you have any technical difficulties, please message Rainey through the chat and she will help you out. And just want to say this event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. And you can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, including one where Dan was on a couple of months ago. So you can find all of our presentations there. Thank you so much to all of you. And Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, here, let me get some slides up. Let me see if I do this right. How's that looking? Can you all see my home slide there? Okay,
Yep.
great. Well, thank you for joining us for this Lunch and Learn. As Maggie said, my name is Dan Marks. I am the superintendent in the town of Falmouth, superintendent for the Wastewater Department, and I'm also the co-chair of the Government Affairs Committee for the Maine Water Environment Association. And today I'm excited to talk to you about sludge. It's one of my favorite topics. There are so many fascinating aspects that I plan to get into today, not the least of which, and maybe a little bit philosophical, is that sludge is a mixture of all of our lives, the things that we've consumed, used up, and wasted. I often say that if you want to understand our relationship with nature, go to a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill and see what it is that we are wasting as a society. In my view, and for those of us who care deeply about the environment, this is an important place to start. Here's a picture of sludge floating on the Androscoggin River, just above the Gulf Island Dam above Lewiston. And this is not the place that we want to see sludge. I love this photo because it shows how far we've come in protecting the environment and water quality. It was taken in June of 1973 as part of an EPA effort to photo document the condition of water bodies before the Clean Water Act went into effect. The dramatic images of rivers on fire with industrial pollution laid bare the need to take better care of our water. Enter Edmund Muskie. Senator Muskie was from Rumford, upstream from Lewiston on the Androscoggin River, and he famously spearheaded drafting and passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. So as many of you know, Maine has always been a leader on environmental issues. Prior to the Clean Water Act, sewers discharged into the closest water body. So another way to ask that question on the first slide while you waited would be, prior to the Clean Water Act, what water body would you have dumped your sewage into? And so we've come a long, long way. The Clean Water Act and the wastewater treatment facilities that it built, in my opinion, have been the single greatest public achievement to clean up our rivers. 50 years after the Clean Water Act, Our publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities are facing new challenges, not the least of which are the age of our infrastructure and climate change, given that most of our infrastructure was installed 50 to even 100 years ago, and that much of our infrastructure is located in low-lying or coastal areas, subject to all the hazards of climate change. These new challenges also include an increasingly dire situation associated with limited outlets for sludge disposal. Our publicly owned treatment facilities are being asked to solve modern concerns, such as nanoplastics, PFAS, and pharmaceuticals, when we were designed for the problems of 50 years ago. My main goal for today is to invite you to change the way you think about sludge. I hope to prove to you that sludge is way more interesting than you thought. Sludge could play a central role to address many overlapping concerns we have, such as climate change, environmental contamination, soil health, and nutrient loss. I also hope to convey to you the imperative to deal with our consumption and the waste that we produce. No matter what we can do on the treatment end, eliminating toxic chemicals from the things we consume is the only way to effectively deal with this contamination. In today's presentation, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a roller coaster ride. How we create sludge at the wastewater treatment plant is really a success story of the modern environmental movement that has cleaned up our rivers. When we talk about what we do with sludge currently, especially in Maine, it might get a little depressing. I hope to lift you back up when I return to the vision to talk about what we could do with our sludge. How we get there is tricky. It will require consensus building and lots of money. I will also show that effectively dealing with the contamination in our environment, as I said, will require that we deal with our consumption and how we have invited modern chemicals into our lives. But I don't want to end on a sour note, so I will include some case studies of the path that's forward, that's already being carved out, and ways that you can support the work. These case studies are steps on a path towards a vision of sludge management that can help to correct the contamination we have consumed and wasted. I will revisit this slide a bit later after providing some more background, but in general, I hope to arrive at a place where we can deal with the contamination and concerns inherent in sludge and then realize the value of this material. We still good? Everybody good? Okay. Now let me back up a little bit and let's talk about wastewater in more detail. The wastewater that we all produce is our raw material at the treatment plant, but what is it? This table on the screen lists the range of nutrient values in wastewater. I know it's hard to read, so I don't need you to read it, but in general, I want to focus on the BOD, nitrogen, and phosphorus present in wastewater. BOD, or biological oxygen demand, is essentially a measure of the organic material present in wastewater, and it was a primary pollutant that was regulated by the Clean Water Act. As a backyard gardener, it has struck me that what we consider waste at the wastewater treatment plant is what farmers and gardeners call fertilizer. So this table is essentially showing the NPK and the organic value of wastewater. Considering that we are approaching N phosphorus and the vast amount of energy we use to synthesize nitrogen fertilizer, this becomes a significant consideration. So with our waste fertilizer, we could literally grow food. But what's not listed in this table? I want to use the chat one more time. In other words, what else is in our wastewater besides these nutrients? So go ahead, use the chat. I want a little audience involvement here. Let me see if I can open up the chat. I don't even know. Maggie,
I opened it up.
Thank you. What do we got? Then we have people entering. What else is in our wastewater?
PFAS, chemicals, plastics, hormones.
Yes, yes.
Heavy metals.
Yeah, pretty much. That's great. People can keep adding things there as I keep going here. But everything we wash or flush down the drain ends up at the wastewater treatment plant eventually. And what I want to make very clear and put a point on is that the wastewater treatment facility is a reflection of our society. The nutrients, the organic material, as well as the contamination comes from us and our modern lifestyles. This will be very important as we talk about PFAS and other contamination. We may be able to deal with it at the treatment plant, but the best thing to do, as I mentioned, is deal with our consumption. And as you may imagine, much of the contamination that we receive at the treatment plant ends up in what we produce, which is sludge. So I want to talk about sludge. Sludge is the inevitable and unavoidable product of the treatment process. How do we make it? This is an aerial photo of the Falmouth treatment facility. The treatment plant can be thought of as a series of barriers between the waste we produce and nature. And in my last talk with MCV that Maggie referenced, it was linked in the invitation for today's presentation, I went into a lot more detail about the wastewater treatment process. For today's purposes, I wanted to move more quickly through the process, highlighting those barriers that we employ at the treatment plant between the waste we produce as a society and nature at a higher level. The first barrier is the headworks, where we remove inorganic insoluble material from the waste stream. The next barrier is the aeration tank, where we remove organic material and nutrients. If you attended my last presentation, I said that at the wastewater treatment plant, we are microbe farmers. We grow bacteria, we grow microbes, which in turn consume organic waste and nutrients. We provide the right environment in terms of food, nutrients, and oxygen for the microbes to do this function. Our operators work every day to manage what we call the food to mass ratio, where the food is the influent organic material and the mass is the concentration of microbes that we need to consume that food. And not to toot our own horns, but we are so good at growing microbes that we have to get rid of some of them. And if we didn't, we would be totally overrun. In practice, this would look just like sludge floating on the river of that picture I love. So we waste the microbes, and this is what we call sludge. From the aeration tank, we move to our next process, the clarifiers. Clarification is the next barrier. While in the aeration tank, we generate sludge through microbial activity. In the clarifiers, we separate the sludge from the clean water. We do this through a physical process of settling, where we quiet the flow and allow the sludge to settle to the bottom, where we can then collect it. The clarifiers is the point at which we now have two products, what we call the liquid stream and the solid stream. Following the liquid stream, the next barrier is disinfection, where we remove any harmful pathogens. Once we have disinfected the liquid stream, the water is discharged into the environment, as represented by the blue line here. What should be clear is that the wastewater treatment facility is a barrier for the things it is designed to be a barrier for. This is organic waste, solids, some nutrients, large insoluble inorganic material, and pathogens. At current, your publicly owned wastewater treatment facility is not designed to be a barrier to all the chemical contamination from our modern lifestyles. So now let's take a look at the solids train, or the sludge. This image shows another barrier where we remove volatile solids from the sludge in our digesters before we dewater the sludge and dispose of it off-site, as represented by the brown line heading off the page to the left. So once we've created the sludge, what do we do with it? This is data from the EPA showing the nationwide picture. Generally, there are 3 buckets. Nationally, the majority of sludge is land applied. About a quarter is landfilled, and the remainder is incinerated. In Maine, by law, we are now only utilizing one of these buckets. Prior to the discovery of contaminated milk on a farm in southern Maine, and going back to the 1970s, most Maine sludge was beneficially reused by land application. This solved our sludge disposal problem, meaning that we needed a place to get rid of it, and it was a source of cheap fertilizer for farmers. What I'm quote-unquoting beneficial reuse was promoted by the US EPA and the Maine DEP. In 2021, Maine led the nation by banning the land application of sludge due to the presence of PFAS. Once again, Maine's taken a leadership environmental role. Some other states have followed suit, but really the whole nation is watching what we do in Maine on this issue. So let me take a second and I think probably everyone here knows, but I'll do a quick, what is PFAS? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are used in various products for their water, stain, and grease-resistant properties. Think Gore-Tex jackets, Teflon, and other non-stick cookware coatings, stain-resistant furniture, and carpets. It is also in many cosmetics, clothing and shoes, soaps and waxes, personal care products. The list is long. It is a family of thousands of chemicals, common in their carbon-fluorine bond, that is known to be one of the strongest bonds that can be made in chemistry. Thus, they have been called forever chemicals. They were first introduced in the 1940s, and PFAS have now been found in polar bears and in rain. PFAS are ubiquitous, and they are also found in our sludge. And let me be clear, the spreading of sludge on farm fields has ruined people's lives. Farms and businesses have closed, and people are worried about their health and impacts from high levels of PFAS exposure. Now that we no longer land apply sludge, the landfill is our only option. So this picture that I'm showing you here is the Juniper Ridge landfill, where the vast majority of the sludge produced at the wastewater treatment plants of Maine ends up. But what happens to PFAS in the landfill? As rain falls on the landfill, chemicals including PFAS end up in the leachate. Leachate is usually, hopefully, pumped to a wastewater treatment plant, where PFAS ends up in the sludge and back at the landfill. So, under this model, we are accumulating PFAS. This is clearly not a sustainable solution, but it is what we are doing at the present moment. This is also the first indication we have that we need to remove PFAS and all contamination at the source, in other words, in the products that we consume. So in Maine, we took a leadership step towards protecting our farmland from PFAS. But what is on the other side of that equation? Here's an article from the Maine Sunday Telegram from March 19, 2023. From Maine to California, the solution to sludge is not settled. You see there was a little pun there with the clarification, but that's a wastewater joke. In fact, the disposal approach in Maine, banning the spread on farmland because of PFAS risks, directly opposes the tack by eco-conscious California. On the right, I am showing output from the biosolids emission assessment model that speaks to the organics position that California has taken. The model calculates emissions based on factors from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, combining methane, CO2, and nitrous oxide into CO2 equivalent per ton. That's on the y-axis there. Effectively, what this model shows is that sludge in the landfill is a carbon source to the atmosphere, while land application of sludge acts as a carbon sink. This is because organic material in the landfill creates methane, which adds to the climate crisis. Carbon put back into the soil and properly managed will stay in the soil and sequester more carbon. Also, I am showing here the nutrient value of sludge and why it was deemed a fertilizer before the concern over contaminants. Well, there have always been concern over contaminants going back to the 70s. Again, producing nitrogen fertilizer is a costly environmental proposition. Something I read found that 2% of the total US energy consumption, everything, is used just to convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia. Phosphorus is a finite resource with dwindling reserves. It's a mined material. Sludge is a material that we already produce to protect the environment, and it has its own inherent environmental value. By putting this material in a landfill, we are missing out on an important nutrient source. In Maine and in California, both states are trying to do the best they can to protect their citizens and the environment. The reality is, at present moment, we are choosing protecting our farmland and the food that comes from it, or protecting the climate and the air that we breathe. And I hope that we will one day not have to make this choice. Here's a busy slide. I don't expect you to read it all. But capacity of Maine's landfills is another significant issue with our current sludge disposal approach. So I'll point out some important things on this figure, which is from a 2023 study funded by the Maine DEP. You can see the horizontal line at around 88,000 tons per year of sludge, which is the total sludge production in Maine in 2022. Tag 3, or circle 3, shows the Crossroads landfill in Norridgewock, which is owned by Waste Management, and the startup of their sludge dryer. It says 2025, but it's now looking like more like mid-2026. And the Crossroads capacity is shown in the light green bar. I'll talk more about Norridgewock in a future slide. Circle 4, tag 4, shows the Juniper Ridge capacity being hit in 2028 if JRL is not expanded. JRL capacity is shown in light blue. The actual capacity estimate can fluctuate based on other solid waste disposal rates, percentage of recycling, the amount of sludge that is accepted there. But an important note, even with the dryer at Norridgewock, there is no landfill that can handle all of the sludge produced in the state outside of JRL. The upshot of this figure is that landfill capacity is another issue in Maine. Related to the landfill capacity, a final and important issue in sludge disposal in the landfill. In the fall of 2024, the Board of Environmental Protection completed what they call a public benefit determination for the expansion of JRL, finding that the expansion is in the public's best interest. Shortly thereafter, as reported in this Maine public article, the Penobscot Nation and CLF sued the state to stop the expansion. Without wading into the lawsuit, I wanted to note that landfills have historically been sited in the backyards of impoverished and disenfranchised communities. JRL sits in Old Town, directly upstream of the Penobscot Nation. I know MCV just put on an environmental justice lunch and learn, and so the term sacrifice zones applies here too. The other landfill that is part of this discussion, as I mentioned on the last slide, is the Crossroads landfill. Crossroads is in Norridgewock on Abenaki land. As wastewater utilities and a protector of the environment, speaking for myself, I do not want to be in the position of having to advocate against the Penobscot Nation for a continued injustice. The reality of producing sludge and the need to dispose of it has put us in this position. We need other options. And to summarize, in Maine, we have chosen to protect our lands and PFAS from PFAS via sludge application. And that decision comes with costs in terms of climate change, nutrient loss, landfill capacity, and environmental injustice. Okay, that was a little depressing, I know. And I told you this would be a little bit of a roller coaster. So let me get back to the vision. This is the slide I shared close to the beginning. Reducing the volume of sludge will make the disposal problem smaller in scale. For as long as land application is banned, reducing volume by drying will preserve landfill capacity with less sludge volume and reduce need for bulking agents. And as I will show in the following slides, this work is underway on multiple fronts. The technologies are tested and proven and ready for deployment on industrial scale. The next phase of this is to do something with the contamination. Drying sludge does not remove the contamination. PFAS in particular, because of the strong carbon-fluorine bond, needs to be broken apart with high temperatures and/or high pressures. These technologies are still being developed and proven to be made ready for prime time in an industrial scale application. The promise of these technologies is that the end product can be something that can be used beneficially, such as maybe a nutrient-dense or organic-rich material that could be once again land applied, or a building material additive potentially, or a filter media that captures other contamination. These are all end products that are being looked at. And because of the latent energy in organic material, these processes can actually produce energy. The early pilot scale data is showing that they can at least be energy neutral, but they may be energy positive. Finally, and this is me putting all my best hopes out there, that if we are investing in technologies that can destroy PFAS, that can break that carbon-fluorine forever bond, then we are breaking down the waste into its elemental components. And in doing so, we will be destroying any other toxic organic compounds that may be found in our waste streams. Compounds that we aren't worried about at present, but that are part of our modern chemical lives that we may be worried about at some point in the future. So that's the vision. Here's a hot off the press research project submitted for publication this year. This paper looks at a circular economy model applied to clean water and resource recovery. We can see the problems, all the problems and challenges that we have discussed on the left-hand side. And we see on the right in green is the vision in graphical form, with organic solids or sludge, biosolids, sitting right in the middle of energy independence, clean water, nutrient preservation, and soil health. We can see the benefits of a better solution to our sludge problem. We can generate electricity, sequester carbon, offset fertilizer demand, and save billions of dollars in disposal costs. Adding other forms of organic wastes, such as compost, which probably also contains PFAS, would only increase the power produced and the nutrients recovered. We are currently in the middle, the transition. So next, I'm going to share some case studies that are bringing us through this transition. The Lewiston Auburn Clean Water Authority is the third largest wastewater plant in the state. LACWA, a number of years ago, built an anaerobic digester to stabilize their sludge, and they recently installed upgraded dewatering. The next step for LACWA is a dryer. This would bring their sludge from around 20% solids now to 80 to 90% solids or better. The total installation cost is estimated at this point around $7.5 million, and this facility is just sized for the Lewiston Auburn sludge production. They are at about 30% design today and probably about 4 years estimated before they would be operational. Here's another case study, getting back to the Crossroads landfill in Norridgewock. Waste Management is spending almost $40 million at this facility, betting on the value of sludge disposal market in New England. In addition to the landfill on site, they have an existing energy plant that is fired on landfill gas and is expected to power up to 2/3 of the electricity needed for the dryers. 73,000 tons of sludge capacity is about 88% of the total sludge produced in Maine. That being said, Waste Management is planning to and will take out-of-state sludge to fill their capacity. They are planning to treat their leachate, the liquid underdrain from the landfill, for PFAS using foam fractionation. I'm not sure what they're planning to do with the PFAS-laden foam, but if it goes to the landfill, then we have that same accumulating issue that I mentioned earlier. It may be obvious that foam frac is not a technology that can treat sludge, but it is an option for liquid wastes. So let's talk about PFAS treatment for sludge. This is from the EPA's PFAS Innovative Treatment Team, PIT, or a multidiscipline research group. Technology readiness levels, or TRLs, are an indication as they sound of how ready a technology is for the market. EPA reviewed many different technologies that have the ability to destroy PFAS. For biosolids, SCWO or supercritical water oxidation and pyrolysis are the most ready for market. This chart is from 2021, so things obviously have advanced since then. At this point, there are a couple of full-scale installations that are being piloted, and I expect in the next couple of years, these technologies will be ready for industrial scale markets. So let me talk a little bit about these two technologies. Wastewater operators and folks have always been leading adapters of proven technology. Pyrolysis is the heating of organic matter in the absence of oxygen. It is how we produce biochar using any dried biomass feedstock. Some companies have developed technologies to make biochar with sewage sludge. So let me see if I can get this to work. It's actually a video here. Is that moving along? Okay. This is a video from one of the manufacturers that's making a pyrolysis machine. They start by heating circulating air through a heat exchanger or oxidation chamber using an outside fuel source. This preheats the pyrolysis reactor on the bottom left. And once the pyrolysis reactor is up to temperature, dried biosolids are introduced. The absence of oxygen creates a synthetic gas that can be conditioned and used to fire the oxidation chamber that heats the process. So once this machine is up and running, theoretically again, and it seems like it's being proven, the dried sludge is a fuel that powers the process. This company is working on creating markets for their product, which they call Our Carbon. And the potential outlets they're looking at include inks and dyes or concrete additives. Biochar is very popular in regenerative agriculture, as you may know, as a soil amendment that sequesters carbon. Further processing of biochar to increase the surface area results in activated carbon. Some drinking water utilities are using activated carbon to remove PFAS from their drinking water wells. So imagine that we could turn biosolids into activated carbon that could remove PFAS from drinking water. Turn that off. Okay, we're doing all right. Here we go. Okay, great. The other promising technology is called supercritical water oxidation. So this chart is showing a plot of pressure versus temperature. And at extremely high pressures and temperature, water enters a fourth state, the supercritical phase. It's not a solid, liquid, or gas. It appears something like a vapor. When you introduce wastewater into a supercritical vessel and add air, it creates a strong reaction. This is a process diagram from one of the manufacturers making a supercritical water oxidation treatment facility for sludge. Waste is introduced on the left, preheated with spent heat from the process, and introduced to the reactor where it achieves the supercritical condition. Heat and pressure are recovered and used to preheat and run the system. And at the end of the day, again, theoretically, we are left with pure water and minerals. We create energy from the biomass, and we vent carbon dioxide and nitrogen gas. Again, with both of these technologies, the promise is that the very strong carbon-fluorine bond will be broken. And in doing so, the other contaminants in the material will be reduced to their elemental state. If we are doing that with PFAS, then we may also be breaking the bonds of other chemicals, the contaminants of emerging concern. That is my hope, but we are still early on in the testing and proving stages of this. I wanted to make a quick note about detection limits and the approach to zero contamination. The table with the blue heading is recently released draft human health ambient water quality criteria for PFOA and PFAS from the EPA in December of 2024. PFOA and PFAS are two of the most studied of the thousands of PFAS chemicals. These draft criteria can be used to ultimately develop permit conditions for discharge license holders like wastewater treatment facilities. A couple of problems with these criteria. First, these levels cannot be measured with any available analytical method. For example, the recently finalized method that EPA just approved has a detection limit of about 0.5 nanograms per liter. That's parts per trillion for PFOA. These human health criteria are thousandths of a part per trillion or part per quadrillion. These are unfathomably small amounts that cannot be detected with current methods. Second, these levels do not consider technological feasibility. For example, on the left of this slide, I am showing a recent sludge test from Falmouth for PFOA and PFAS, around 15 and 24 parts per trillion respectively. To achieve these limits would require 6 log removal for PFOA and 4 log removal for PFAS. It is unclear if any of the technologies, while theoretically they could, if they could achieve that in a measurable way. In Falmouth, just a quick note, is an interesting case. because we are almost entirely residential sewer users, no industry. DEP and some larger utilities, such as the Portland Water District, sampled for PFAS throughout their collection systems. Essentially, what they found is that sewer sheds of industrial users had very similar PFAS levels to residential areas. They also found that approximately 90% of the total influent measured PFAS loading is attributed to residential. The PFAS is coming from us, from our consumption lifestyle. As a society, we could decide that PFAS treatment of sludge is the right thing to do, and we seem to be headed in that direction, and I applaud that. But it may not get us to zero. Even if theoretically we are destroying all of it, we may not be able to prove it with an analytical method at concentrations so small. The upshot is that we need to get these chemicals out of our consumption. Turn off the tap. Once they are released into our homes and the environment, it is very difficult to get them out. And be wary of replacement chemicals that provide the same expected functionality. These may well be the chemicals I will be presenting about in 10 years. What other chemicals are out there that we don't know about yet? The family of PFAS chemicals may include around 10,000 different configurations, but there are upwards of 80,000 chemicals on the EPA's toxic substance control list. I am advocating for a more precautionary-based approach to modern science before we allow these materials into our homes. Okay, again, we're on the roller coaster, but nation is watching Maine and how we deal with this contamination issue. And there are some projects under development looking at PFAS destruction in sludge. The first case study I'll share is in Sanford. Aries is a company employing the gasification process, which is very similar to pyrolysis, but it uses a small and controlled amount of oxygen, as opposed to the absence of oxygen. Here's a pretty cartoon that they put out. The planned capacity is greater than the entire state's sludge production. They will be bringing in out-of-state sludges to justify this investment, and they are currently in the permitting stages. Another case study. This is from the Portland Water District. They have an MOU with EcoMaine to site a biosolids processing facility at the landfill in Outer Portland. The EcoMaine sited facility would be regional, with better opportunity for economies of scale and no need to expand the footprint at existing wastewater treatment facility sites. So what PWD is looking at is a phased approach where they first add anaerobic digestion to stabilize the sludge, and then in phase 2, they would add PFAS treatment as the technology matures. As you may imagine, all of this stuff is very, very expensive, so I wanted to include a note about costs. Minnesota is another state that has been looking at PFAS very closely. A rural agricultural state like Maine, they have dealt with PFAS and products and AFFF similar to Maine. Instead of an outright land application ban, Minnesota has taken the approach of trying to balance the value of sludge with the risks of contamination. They have done this through tiers of PFAS contamination, recognizing that not all PFAS contamination is equal. The reason I bring up Minnesota is that their pollution control agency put out these cost curves in May of 2023. Here's a capital cost curve for the pyrolysis treatment of PFAS. Note that this cost does not include any pretreatment stabilization, and it does not include recurring operating or maintenance costs. And just as a data point, in Falmouth, we produce about 850 wet tons of sludge per year. And at about 20% solids, that works out to about a half a ton of dry solids per day, which is the x-axis in this chart. Dry tons per day is DTPD. Below the curve on this chart, so again, we can see the benefits of economies of scale. If Falmouth were to go it alone, we would have to assume a capital project of around $20 million, and then another couple $100,000 per year in O&M costs, and whatever we would need for pretreatment to get it ready. This slide is showing a rough breakdown of all the wastewater facilities in the state. There's almost around 150 of them. In Falmouth, we are in the 1 to 2 million gallons per day category, so you can really see the need for regionalization to get up on the cost curves that were produced by Minnesota. But just as a thought exercise, real rough numbers and real big picture, if Maine produces 88,000 wet tons of sludge each year at around 20%, that is about 60 dry tons each and every day across the whole state. Say we package these into 6 regional facilities, which is a challenge, logistical challenge up north due to the smaller facilities and the distances between them, as you can see in the map. But say each of these 6 facilities were sized around 10 dry tons per day. Based on the charts from Minnesota, we would be looking at 6 $80 million facilities. So call that $500 million. And again, this is not counting pretreatment conditioning or the impact to operating costs. As another data point, the PWD project I showed earlier for all phases that do include pretreatment, sludge conditioning, is estimated at around 181 million, but it could be as high as 300 million. The conceptual design included a range. And a note that this facility would be a little over 40 dry tons per day as a regional facility, which could theoretically handle more than half of the state's sludge. The Minnesota cost curves would put this size facility around 270 million just for the capital for PFAS treatment. As the case studies show, this work is being pushed forward, and I believe the PFAS treatment technologies will be brought to market on the industrial scale that we need. But I want you all to understand the mountain we are climbing and the work to build the consensus around the need and the cost impacts. Publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities generally are funded only by ratepayers, not the public at large. Again, this points to the importance of a funding mechanism, like a statewide bond, so that the cost of PFAS treatment does not fall only on ratepayers' shoulders, when we all have the potential to receive this benefit of PFAS treatment. And I want to put the PFAS costs in context of what I mentioned at the start. The age of infrastructure and climate change risks are also driving capital expenditures in wastewater systems. Every few years, the Maine DEP issues a needs survey to all the clean water facilities, and the most recent result shows $1.9 billion in wastewater infrastructure needs alone. This does not include costs for potential future regulations, including PFAS treatment. This is what facilities need to maintain the status quo infrastructure that has been protecting our waters for decades and keeping sludge out of our rivers. So, okay, let me try to sum it up. I want to leave time for a healthy Q&A because I've gone through a lot. I actually don't know what time it is here. We're doing okay. The wastewater treatment plant has always been a barrier between the waste we produce and the environment, and we will continue to play this role. Without sludge, we wouldn't have clean water. The wastewater treatment plant provides an opportunity to treat for the contamination that is wasted from our modern living, and in doing so, protect our water environment. Zooming out, when we consider the future of soil health and fertility and the climate crisis, I believe we should also get back to tapping the nutrients, organic material, and latent energy in sludge, as sludge is a product we are already producing and will continue to produce. Given the vast amounts of energy we expend creating nitrogen fertilizer, finite phosphorus reserves, and the climate impacts of landfilling organic material, I do not believe we can continue to ignore the value of sludge. However, as indicated by the limits of PFAS treatment and our inability to measure to zero, we must also eliminate our consumption of the many, many products that contain these chemicals. We must be willing to engage with a nuanced conversation about waste, environmental contamination, and nutrient recovery, and as a society, balance the risks. That being said, thank you for the opportunity to provide some context for what we do every day and for the value of sludge, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. And with that, Maggie, I wanted to try to leave some time for questions.
Yes, and before we hop into the Q&A, we're going to turn it briefly over to Adam. And if you, perfect.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Dan, for that incredible presentation. Super interesting. I learned a lot. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Nordell. I'm a campaign manager at the environmental nonprofit Defend Our Health. I'm also a PFAS impacted farmer. My wife and I owned Songbird Farm, which was in Unity, Maine, and farmed organically for 7 years on land that had been spread with sludge in the early 1990s and turned out to be severely contaminated. I appreciate the opportunity to offer a little bit of perspective from the PFAS impacted farmer community. I think there are some pretty exciting opportunities for coalition building between farmers, between environmental organizations, and between the wastewater districts. And I've had the opportunity to work in that spirit with Dan and some of his colleagues at MOEA, his trade organization. So I applaud all of your work to solve this problem, Dan, and the other colleagues that I know are that are listening in. So zooming out a little bit to think about the historic impacts of Maine's sludge management on the farming community and elsewhere in rural Maine, I think it bears mentioning that Maine DEP is investigating the historic land application sites following the discovery of contamination at Fred Stone's farm that Dan mentioned earlier. DEP is partway through that process. They've thus far identified 83 farms with concerning contamination, either of their soil or their water. They're using Maine's 20 parts per trillion interim drinking water standard for that threshold. And they're using a soil threshold of 6.7 parts per billion PFOS, which is the level at which the state understands that PFAS can contaminate cow milk to an unsafe level. And just for reference, the soil at some of these farms is several orders of magnitude above that 6.7 threshold. The soil on my farm was up around 400 parts per billion PFOS alone. So we've got a problem. It's a pretty significant problem. The state is investing a lot of money into helping farmers navigate the crisis. Between state and federal funds, $70 million sit in our PFAS fund that are helping, where possible, farms pivot and produce safe food. Some of us, like Fred Stone and myself, have gone out of business. And then the health impacts are shared between the farming community and our employees, our families, and our neighbors. PFAS doesn't respect property boundaries. Once it's in the environment, as Dan said, there it is, and there it can spread. So in a parallel investigation to the farmland investigation, DEP has been looking at contaminated groundwater wells near those land application sites, and has thus far identified almost 500 contaminated wells, again, using our current drinking water standard. The legislature just approved a bill to lower our drinking water standard and bring it into harmony with EPA's drinking water standard of 4 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA, which will take a few years to implement. But Maine DEP has said that they anticipate there are more like 1,000 contaminated household wells if you use that lower standard. So the contamination is widespread and has impacted a lot of families in Maine. Maine DEP currently has funding to provide filters for those contaminated well owners, which is great. Hopefully that funding lasts for the lifetime of all of those people living on those contaminated sites. But for those of us who've been living and prior to learning of the contamination, we've accumulated a pretty severe body burden and are living with the health impacts, and those costs are borne privately, unfortunately. And in instances, those have impacted people as badly as you could imagine. PFAS is linked with liver disease, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, breast cancer, thyroid disorders, autoimmune disorders of the digestive tract, and more. So there's a sort of a nasty array of illnesses that can befall people who have elevated exposures. I think it's incredibly important that we learn a precautionary lesson from this experience, and that we invest in Maine's current framework. We can't go back to spreading sludge on farmland, but we don't want to overburden our wastewater district engineers. They're doing an incredible job to protect our rivers, and we need them to succeed managing the sludge safely as well. So we all have an investment in seeing those infrastructure funds get approved, the dryers get built, so that the wastewater operators can safely and effectively dispose of the sludge in the landfill without putting our farms at risk or bearing undue costs. So I highly recommend that everybody support that bond when it comes back up in the second half of our session this next year. And then also on sort of the precautionary principle, we're talking about a handful of PFAS chemicals when we think about regulating PFAS in drinking water, when we're looking at PFAS on farms, and when we're regulating PFAS in our wastewater and in our wastewater sludge. We shouldn't think of those as an anomaly. The wastewater systems, as Dan said, are reflective of everything that's in production in our society. They capture things going down the drain in our homes, in our businesses, and they also capture waste streams like the landfill leachate from the landfills that Dan mentioned. So any legacy contamination that's built over decades in the landfill is also represented in some fashion at the wastewater treatment district. PFAS manufacturers have been acutely aware of the toxicity of PFAS and of its environmental persistence since the 1950s. EPA only learned about it in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and now here we are in Maine dealing with it in 2025. since then, chemical manufacturers have moved on to other chemical formulations. We know that pattern is not unique to PFAS. That is the pattern with chemical manufacturers. We don't know what's going into our waste stream until it's too late if we make unwise decisions about our waste management. So I really just want to strongly argue that we invest in safe, sustainable, well-managed solutions for our sludge, keep them off of farmland, and support our wastewater treatment operators in their success moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you so much, Dan. And we have gotten so many questions, so we're going to try and fit in as many as we can. If we go over a couple of minutes, I apologize. But I wanted to start with something hopefully positive. Was- I'm curious about how other countries around the world might be dealing with PFAS. Are there any major differences? Are there any bright spots? Are we leading the way? To either of you, I'd love to hear about
I want to hear Adam's perspective on this too, but I think that a lot of these technologies that I went over kind of originated in Europe. A lot of them have found, some of the pilot work that's coming out from Europe. Um, and my general sense is that uh, other countries have taken more of what I shared as the Minnesota approach, like a tiered recognition rather than an outright ban, recognizing again, there are these sort of thresholds that we don't want to go by, but that the need to continue to be able to dispose of sludge is a critical public health or environmental function that we need to balance. So that's my sense. Adam, I don't know if you know more of that. I don't study the global piece of it as much.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I don't understand the international context as well as I would like to. I know that um, some of our neighbors to the north in Canada have been following what's the situation in Maine and have responded by investigating um, PFAS in sludge and are considering their own approaches, but I'm not sure where that's landed. Um, Likewise, in Europe, I know that broadly Europe is better at regulating chemicals in society than the United States is, and is taking a more expansive approach to regulating PFAS. So they for example, use a much better and more expansive definition of what are PFAS than EPA currently does. Um, Europe is also setting regulatory limits for PFAS in the food system, which is something that FDA is failing to do or failing to investigate very well. We have a few regulatory limits for PFAS in foodstuffs here in Maine. Other states, I don't believe other states in the country are working to protect consumers. I didn't mention that aspect of the PFAS contamination crisis. Of course, we all eat food that's grown on farms, so we need to keep our farms clean. Um, so Europe is far ahead of the United States on that front. And then just a quick note about the Minnesota limits that Dan mentioned. I believe those are modeled off of an approach that was developed in Michigan following the discovery of contamination at Jason Grostic Cattle Company, an impacted cattle farm there. And they've been successful using those thresholds in an industrial pretreatment framework where they're getting industrial users to clean up their wastewater before it goes to the wastewater treatment district. So the costs of cleanup are borne by the polluter, which is a good model. Unfortunately, as Michigan regulators have acknowledged, they're not based on modeled health outcomes. So that 20 parts per trillion threshold isn't actually modeled to protect anyone's health. It's just modeled to capture the industrial contributions.
Thank you both so much. And a question for both of you as well. What do you see as the biggest misconception that the public has about sludge or biosolids? And how do you think we can shift that narrative constructively?
You want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, sure. I would say that one of the things I said during the presentation is that without sludge, we wouldn't have clean water. The image that I showed on numerous slides of sludge floating in the Androscoggin River is an indication that if we don't create sludge at the treatment plant, nature will create sludge in the environment, which is what we don't want to do. And then I think the other major piece is that there's just a lot of inherent value. Obviously, we're focusing now on the contamination concerns. And I think, again, just to reiterate, the promise of these technologies is that if we're treating for PFAS, we can be treating for other things as well. And I hope to get back to a point where we can acknowledge and value the benefits of sludge as well. And just a quick note on disposal, because I was realizing as Adam talked about Canada, when we were sort of going through the sludge disposal crisis when the first land application ban went into effect, we were actually shipping our sludge to Canada. That's what Juniper Ridge had shut down, and we were shipping sludge to New Brunswick. And that was obviously a very tenuous time and tenuous situation. And I think what we would argue for in the wastewater world is we need multiple and diverse options for disposing of our sludge. We need a resilient disposal option so that we don't rely solely on one outcome. And landfilling is what we're doing now. And as I showed in the presentation, the capacity of our landfills is being tested through that. Drying sludge in and of itself won't get us there. It may stave off the problem for a number of years, but ultimately we need to work ourselves towards being able to use or look at sludge disposal in a different way. So anyways, I wanted to add that note about the international piece.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you just said, Dan. I honestly don't think people think enough about sludge. So if there's a common misconception, I think with so many aspects of our waste stream and our production economy for that matter, we've been trained to move through the world as consumers and not think about how we're interacting with our environment, not thinking about where the garbage goes when we put it out on the curb, not think about wastewater at all. So I think if I could correct a misconception, I would just ask people to think more about our wastewater watershed, what's captured by the wastewater watershed, and where it terminates as effluent and as sludge. So keep attending webinars like this one.
Thank you so much, Adam. And in our call to action, we will be suggesting that you continue your learning about wastewater management and please tour your local publicly owned treatment works. But I have one more question I want to get to at least. Obviously, you both have mentioned how complex and multi-stakeholder this issue is. So what would you think good collaboration between municipal leaders, scientists, health advocates, farmers, regulators would look like in practice? What's working well right now and what's getting in the way? Big question.
Adam, do you want to take that one first?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So I think with any stakeholders, you're operating with a overlapping Venn diagram, those overlapping ovals, and you have areas of common vision and areas where you maybe don't agree or you don't understand the problem in the same way, and that's natural. That's being a person in the world. So I think where possible, where we can focus on our shared understanding and our shared mission. We all want a clean, healthy food system. We all want clean rivers. We want well-functioning public infrastructure. And where the PFAS issue has been a real challenge for all of us in differing ways. We can all agree on source reduction, of course. So let's double down on Maine's PFAS and products ban and get it out of the waste stream before it enters the waste stream, and then support each other in our efforts to protect public health where we can.
Yeah, I think the perspective that from the wastewater stakeholders is that we need to continue to be able to function and operate well to provide this critical function that we do for our communities. And so that, I guess what I'm trying to bring into this is that sort of balanced more nuanced kind of conversation about where contamination, I think one of the opportunities of PFAS has shown us that we live in a contaminated environment and that the wastewater plant can play a role in that. And in protecting the environment, we can also produce a valuable resource. So I don't know if that directly answered the question. I think building these kinds of coalitions is one of the things that we're trying to do at the Maine Water Environment Association, and reach across to other environmental advocacy organizations and build those kinds of consensus. Again, that was part of the purpose of this talk.
We are stronger when we work together. Absolutely. This has been so incredible. Thank you both so much. I personally have learned a lot. And you will be getting a follow-up email that gives you a couple of calls to action, things to think about, things to do, touring your local plant. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dan and Adam. This is obviously a really contentious issue, and I love the way that you broke it down and made it really, really digestible. Um, I just wanted to say that we'll be taking off July and August. We're going to be doing some deep lunch and learn planning. So I'm really excited to see all of you back in September. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful summer. And yeah, thank you again, Dan and Adam.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Dan.